Well, welcome to the SSA Glider Pilot Flight Instructor course, the continuation. Uh, Ron right now are back again after my voice is still a little bit uh, gravelly, but I think for the most part I'm okay. I want to say thanks to Rich last week for filling in for me. I was had about 3 days of laryngitis there where I couldn't even talk. So we're going to talk about the learning process, and this is actually a two-part series. There's too much material to cover in one evening, so this is part one of the learning process. And as always, our panel will be Rich Carlson, the SSF chairman, Bert Compton, SSF trustee and FADP, Ken Sorensen, a regional and director, Bob Wander, an advisor, and myself. And thanks to Frank Whiteley for putting this all together for us. So just a quick note for those of you who haven't been with us before, I can't see your questions, but the other panel members can, and they will either answer your questions via text or they will pose them to the panel during a break. And I usually try to take a break about every 7 to 10 minutes, or if there's something that's pressing, we can always take a break in the middle. Okay, so the topics discussed tonight, this comes from the chapter 3 of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook. We're going to talk about what is learning, the learning theory, perceptions, insights, acquiring knowledge, Thorndike and the laws of learning, domains of learning, characteristics of learning, learning styles, acquiring skill knowledge, and the types of practice. So this is about the first 25 or 26 pages of the learning chapter 3. So Aviation Instructor's Handbook, page 3-2. What is learning? Classic definition is it's a change in the behavior of the learner as a result of experience. That's always been the classical definition of it. I remember back when I became a flight instructor, I still remember to this day that definition of changing the behavior. So that's when you know that learning has taken place. Process by which experience brings about a relatively permanent change in the behavior. So experience that when you're flying with a person or you're instructing them on the ground, say you're trying to teach them how to do a weight and balance. Well, eventually they'll get experience in that area, and then you can confirm that they've learned what they need to learn about doing weight and balance. Or another definition: a change in behavior that results from experience and practice. That's more of a flight type thing. We're learning how to do steep turns. Well, we can test that behavioral change as to whether they can accomplish that or not, maintain their pitch attitudes, maintain their bank angles, maintain their coordination, things like that. So we'll go through that. So learning theory, a lot of this stuff is, I'm sure that most of you who have read through this would agree, and I can't disagree with this. Some of it is a little bit difficult to understand. I mean, it's these definitions, these concepts that we're trying to get across are concepts which are, interesting. And the more you get into flight instructing, I think you'll agree that every once in a while you'll see something in your learner as they're going along through learning a topic or a maneuver or something like that, and you'll think, well, that was this kind of learning, or that was that kind of learning, and stuff like that. So it's interesting as you go. Like I said, as you go along, you'll find that you're referring to those kinds of things. So So under the learning theory, they talk about the classical conditioning, and this is on page 3-2, the learning theory. And Pavlov's dog is an example of classic conditioning, and that is, if you read the read this part of the chapter, you'll see that Pavlov discovered that by using a metronome, that he could make his dog associate the ticking of the metronome with the fact that he was going to be fed. And by doing that, reinforcing that behavior, that if the dog listened or heard the metronome ticking, then he or she would come and look to get fed. So that's the classical conditioning, where you do something and your learner then feels like that's, that something is going to be, something is going to happen when they hear that sound, or they hear the what you're trying to put forth. Omnipotent conditioning associated between behavior and the consequences of behavior. So an association. So a person's behavior can be changed by the consequences of that behavior. In other words, if your learner's reaction is a bad behavior uh, to something you're trying to um, put forth. Hold on a second. Just sorry about that. Then the behavior will either not. You hope that if it's a bad consequence from that behavior, in other words, let's say that they don't flare properly and they have a hard landing. Well, that's a consequence of the behavior of not associating the flare of the glider at the proper time. And so that consequence will hopefully deter them from, encourage them a different behavior when they're landing and trying to flare, or recognizing that they need to flare so that they don't get that consequence of a hard landing. Social learning is learning by observation, and that's, it's more of a social setting. Excuse me, I still have some rough throat, so I'm going to be drinking some water here and stuff. Um, but social learning is learning by observation. In other words, I always said that the ground people that ran ropes, back in the day when I was running a glider school, I used to hire kids to come out and run ropes and just generally help us move the gliders around on the ground. And I always observed that those people, young and old, um, did better with their flying, especially they were flying in the pattern and around the airport. And part of that reasoning I always felt was this social learning, the observation. They'd see other people make mistakes. They'd overhear instructors talking to their learners and saying, well, this is why that happened, or whatever. And so therefore that's a type of social learning. They're not directly involved with the learning that's going on, but just by observing other people's habits and behaviors, and then listening to the instructors, overhearing the instructors debriefing and things like that. They were learning by observation, basically. So behaviorism, we talked about last week. We had a chapter 2, which was on behaviors, and Rich Carlson uh, did that admirably. Human behaviorism is um, he talked about that to a large extent, and what behaviors are, and how people behave is a way for you to gain insight as to whether they're learning or not. I mean, if they react positively, have a positive behavior because of your teachings, then they're learning. And if they have a negative behavior, well, they're maybe learning in a different way, but hopefully they'll turn that around and learn in a positive way. So cognitive theory, information processing, constructivism, higher order thinking skills, those are all part of the learning theory. And you can read more about them in the chapter 3 there. Scenario-based training, I think, is something I wanted to emphasize, however, because that's really I think personally that's that concept, not that it hasn't been around a long time under different names, hangar flying, uh, just sitting around the field and conversing with other people. That's to some extent that's scenario-based training, because you hear their experiences, and they pass those experiences on to you, and you learn based on that. But I think even more so in today's world, I think scenario-based training is really important. We can, with the simulators, we can create scenarios that we can't necessarily create as safely in the air, i.e. the low altitude release on tow, PT3, um, and other, flying too large a pattern and demonstrating that they're going to land short of the runway, um, or flying too small a pattern and seeing that they're going to overrun the runway. I mean, those are all scenarios that could happen, and if you do it in a scenario-based training type method, you give a person a situation that says you're on down one leg and you've turned on the base leg and you notice that you're too close to the runway, and so what are you going to do? How are you gonna get the fighter on the ground? And so without as safely as you can. Uh, Obviously, if you're too close to the runway on base leg and you have a tailwind on base leg, it's going to cause people to tend to bank shallowly much of the time and use a rudder to rudder it around, which is an incorrect way to do it, because it's a skidding turn versus you're better off to turn at a steeper bank to get around the corner quicker, and then worry about getting lined up with the runway after you've completed that turn. So perceptions. Learning comes from perceptions using one or more of the 5 senses. I put in there read, study out loud, and this was a technique that I was taught many, many, many years ago, back when I was in college. And for me, it worked. Um, it was a method of study where I was I basically had to be in a room or something all by myself, because I would read out loud uh, while I was studying, and the theory as it was presented to me at the time, which I didn't really understand as well, but I do understand it better now, is that reading out loud to yourself it allows the brain to store that information in different areas. Number one, when you're reading, you're using your eyesight, visual, to read words and interpret the information. And when you're reading out loud to yourself, you're hearing those words as well, and that's involves a different area of the brain, and it allows that information to be stored in in those two areas of the brain versus just one area of the brain. The other thing that the professor who was teaching this technique said that it also keeps your attention. If you start reading something and you lose your train of thought, or you notice yourself saying gibberish, well, then you stop yourself and maybe get up and walk around the room and revitalize yourself. And so then now your study is more effective because you actually are listening to what you're talking. And like I said, besides the fact that it stores it in at least two areas of the brain, that's just reading silently to yourself would only store it in one area of the brain. The tactile feel also, one of the things that this professor recommended also was to write out, if you're just trying to memorize something, was to write things out in longhand, and that's going to engage another area of the brain, the tactile area of the brain. And you'll notice that as we go through this, those concepts will be presented more formally. So factors that affect your perceptions are just your physical organism. I mean, what you perceive is based on how you've been brought up and what you've learned over the years that you've been alive. Young people are perhaps a little sharper, as they say, just because they are able to absorb information perhaps just a little bit more quickly or than we are if they're interested. But we older folks have more experience to rely on when we perceive things. We have some experience that we can rely on to help us make decisions versus or after we get those perceptions. Perceptions relate to goals and values, and that's as we all have certain goals, we all have certain values. I mean, the goal here for most people when they're learning to fly is to learn how to fly, and they have to also learn the information necessary. Just stick and rudder skills in this day and age just aren't um, aren't enough. They're valuable. There's no question about it. They're valuable, but I think that as we've all observed through the years, that um, what we do with those stick and rudder skills, how we get to that point, is equally important. The risk management piece, the decision making pieces that we have to go through, and those are shaped by our goals and our values. Your self concept is an important thing as well, because I know that people that, and we've all seen people who have kind of a shy demeanor. They may be really sharp, they may be are really smart, but that shy demeanor, self-concept, I think to some extent tends to hold them back. And so to try to get them to come out of their shell, so to speak, and I think it really helps them to learn um, in a little quicker method. Time and opportunity. Um, you gotta have opportunity to observe. I've always said that the people who come out for the quickie 1 week, hey, I'm going to learn how to fly course for an add-on rating or whatever, they just don't. They're not giving themselves the time necessary to absorb the material, nor the opportunity necessary to experience different uh, different weather environments, or observe other people flying when they're out there. You got to have time and opportunity in order to have these perceptions as well. Obviously, the element of threat affects your perceptions. If you're threatened by something, you're not going to learn. You have to, the more understanding you have something about something, the less threatening it is. And so, if an instructor makes a blanket statement to their learner, hey, uncoordinated flight is hazardous, well, that's kind of only half the equation. Um, Uncoordinated flight is not necessarily hazardous. In fact, we do on a regular basis do slips to landing. Skidding flight is more hazardous. There's no question about it. It's hazardous if you get the glider to stall during that skidding flight, skidding turn. You do run a higher risk of perhaps entering it into a spin. But with proper training, you'll notice that the slipping turn actually is a very safe maneuver. And if you explain that to the student or demonstrate that to the student, now they're not nearly as uh, uh, they're not nearly as threatened by that, because they can see that not all uncoordinated flight is going to result in a hazardous situation. Do we have any comments so far from the panel that we should address?
Nothing yet.
Thanks. Okay, insights and acquiring knowledge. So the insights are defined as a grouping of processions into meaningful wholes. So how you perceive things, and then you group them into um, let me think if I can think of an example here. Um, well, you'll see this next, the progression of acquiring knowledge. You'll see this next piece as we go through here more: memorization, understanding, and application. And there's a fourth level of learning, which we'll introduce here in a few minutes. But um, so as we perceive things, as we perceive that today that that maneuver didn't work as well because I uh, flew it at the wrong airspeed, and um, and then they group that with a perception of, well, yesterday I did fly it at the correct airspeed, and it worked out a lot better. Well, now they have some insight as to what they did wrong, or what they could do differently in order to uh, make the maneuver or whatever they're trying to accomplish work out better. So a grouping of perceptions that people have will lead to insights. This progression of acquiring knowledge, the very basic is the memorization. You can memorize that the stall airspeed is 35 knots, whatever it is. But unless you understand what stall airspeed means, well, then you're not really have a full understanding of what that 35 knots really means. And we've all told people that gliders will stall at any attitude and any airspeed. So now that understanding is even more um, difficult to rationalize, because uh, recognizing a stall is pretty important. So then we take it to the next level of learning, which is application, and we actually demonstrated, have your learners practice um, stalls, recognition of stalls, and what to do when they recognize the stalls. Lately the FAA's trying to think of the word I'm trying to think of, but their thrust as related to the stall maneuver is more related to recognizing it earlier and not taking it to the full break of the stall. And that has some validity to it, because if you recognize it earlier and apply a correction, well, then the stall never develops. And that's more important, obviously, when you're at 200 feet than when you're at 4,000 feet. However, you might only be 200 feet above the person below you in the thermal. So even though you're not you don't have a situation where you might strike the ground, you certainly might have a situation where you might stall and strike the aircraft below you. So being able to apply the basics of that learning, memorization of, well, the glider stalls at this airspeed, to understanding why gliders stall, and then be able to apply that information um, to the point. And like I said, we'll go on with one more level of learning here in just a minute. But being able to apply that information to avoid stalls and make your flying even safer. So the Thorndike and the laws of learning. So Thorndike came up with the first three: the law of readiness, effect, and exercise. And then later, the last three were added to that list. And again, in the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, page 3-11, they talk about all six of these laws of learning. So let's talk briefly about them. The law of readiness is the learner has to want to learn. They have to be ready to learn new information. If they're so distracted by what's going on at work, and they don't really have the capacity at that point to learn how to do a weight and balance, because they're more concerned about their job. They're not really they don't really have readiness or the want to learn. The law of effect is the need to have success. So everybody wants to be successful, and that's the law of effect. So if you have a person who, again, is so distracted that they're more worried about being successful at playing football that day, and they don't have as much concentration on being successful at what you're trying to teach them, then you need to consider the fact that they don't have the readiness to learn, and and the law of effect is the fact that they don't have that need to be successful at that moment. And as an instructor, you can try to promote that need to be successful. The law of exercise, and that's just like anything, it's practice what is taught. So exercise, whether it's a motor exercise with practice with the way that the feel of the controls, or what you do when you're in a certain situation. Um, the more we exercise uh, that maneuver or that concept by practicing it, well, then we are more likely to be, as long as we're practicing it the correct way, we're more likely to learn it. And that's called the law of exercise. The law of primacy, and that's dictated by what is learned first is usually what you retain, especially when you revert back to if you're in a stressful or pressured situation. You'll probably do whatever you're trying to accomplish the way that you first learned it. That's why it's so important that we as instructors are careful how we train people, and careful in that we don't want to train them incorrectly. That's our responsibility to be good role models, to be well trained ourselves, so that we when we're demonstrating a maneuver or we're talking about a concept, that we talk about it in the correct way. One of the things that I've noticed during check ride orals is that we one of the things that we're supposed to, applicants are supposed to know is about the inoperative equipment on an aircraft and how to handle those situations. And granted, the blanket answer of, well, I would, if there's something not operating, I just ground the glider and go talk to the mechanic, and that's well and good, and that's not a bad solution. But the FAA wants us all to understand how to evaluate on our own where that piece of equipment is, first of all, whether it's necessary or required. And if we deem that it is not necessary or required, well, then what can we do about it? Can we still go fly the aircraft under those conditions? And basically, there's a procedure, 91213 offers us a procedure for evaluating a piece of equipment and then making it inoperative, legally inoperative, so that you can operate the sailplane safely. So, and if you don't teach that right off the bat, if you teach that, you don't have to worry about, I know that tire looks flat, or hey, I know that there's a big rip in the side of the fuselage. You don't have to worry about that. If that's what you first learned, you're going to revert to that in the future, and you're just going to say, "Oh, we don't have to worry about that stuff." And so it's really important that we teach people the way that we want to make sure that they will learn and first and redo situations like that.
Ron, Wander here. Can I weigh in for a moment? Over.
Sure, absolutely, John. Go ahead, Bob.
Bob Wander here, folks. That word law I dislike. Replace it with principle, and I'll go through these 6 with you very quickly. The principle of readiness is the candidate ready and tuned in and eager to learn. That's pretty simple. Yeah. The principle of effect really should be called the principle of positive reinforcement. Once in a while, you need to praise the candidate's reasonably successful performance. They need positive reinforcement. The principle of exercise is that we practice what we're taught. This is why major league players do all sorts of batting practice, right? You exercise what you've learned to keep it sharp. The principle of primacy means that the way you learn to do something first is most likely the way you're going to do it if you get into a jam. So we'd like to have the candidate learn how to do everything properly in the very first introduction that the candidate gets. I was a classical musician for a living, and trust me, if you practice the piece wrong in practice, you will play it wrong on Friday and Saturday nights, right? So it's pretty simple. The law or principle of intensity is, I'll give you an example. If you have a candidate who's been lousy at lookout, looking for other traffic while airborne, and then has a close call with, let's say, a beach bonanza where you can see the rivets on the airplane going by, the intensity of that frightening experience will persuade that candidate to do a better lookout in the future. That's obviously negative learning in this way, but that's what the law of intensity, or the principle of intensity, is about. Finally, the principle of recency is that those things that we've learned most recently are most easily remembered. So these 6 things, when they say law, it looks kind of off-putting. But if you think of them as principles, it's pretty simple. You already knew all this stuff. Thanks, Ron. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. That's a good way to look at it. I'll review this slide in the future and change that. I appreciate that. I'll maybe write myself a note here. But I agree with you. That's very applicable. And this guy Thorndike is who came up with these laws or these principles. Domains of learning. Aviation Instructor Handbook, page 3-13. We have a cognitive domain, which is basically recognize the first three there: rote, understanding, application, and the last one is correlation. We we learn many things by rote. However, our duty as a flight instructor is to try to teach at a higher level than that, because rote is just what it is. It's memorization. You can memorize something, but if you don't understand what you're memorizing, if you can't apply what you're memorizing, or if you can't correlate it to uh, a different maneuver, a different concept, well, then it's just a memorized fact, which is not as useful to a learner as they if they learn at a correlation level. So, as an instructor, we try to teach at the correlation level as much as we can. And I guess I'm a big proponent of. I know that when I just gave a check ride a couple of days ago, a flight instructor check ride, and my favorite maneuver to have the instructor teach is steep turns. And they're a little different in an airplane than they are in a glider. And obviously, in a glider, you're in a spiraling steep turn all the time, and i.e., you're going down. Yeah, the obvious thing to do is find lifting currents that are going up faster than you're going down, thermaling, so that you can stay up. But it's uh, the different aspects of the steep turn are, number one is, what speed do you want to do the steep turn at? Well, you can memorize or think about a rote number of, well, we should do the steep turn at the minimum sink rate speed for the angle of bank that we're in. And that's the minimum sink rate is correspondingly changes as the stall speeds change as well. So I mean, if the stall speed in a 45-degree bank turn is increased 20%, which is approximately what it would increase, then the minimum sink speed is going to increase 20% in that same 45-degree bank turn. And memorize that speed is one thing. Understand why that's happening is just what I just explained. Is that it's related to the stall speed increases, and as the bank angle increases, the stall speed increases. So having a understanding of what the relationship is between stall speed and bank angle, and stall or minimum sink speeds and bank angles uh, gets you at the understanding level of learning as to how you can then go ahead and apply that information. So when you're up flying around, well, now, hey, again, I find people on check rides, they want to do um, steep turns at a speed that's much higher than the minimum sink rate at that angle of bank. And that comes from instructors not really understanding themselves on how to apply these different concepts of what they're trying to accomplish. And the scenario of why we do steep turns is just that. In gliders, we're doing steep turns to be able to thermal successfully and efficiently in smaller thermals. And it's been discussed over the years that the 45-degree bank is the most efficient bank angle for most sailplanes to fly at. So then being able to apply that information, that understanding in a real life scenario of going up and trying to stay up. But even more so than the correlation level would be that, how do I apply some of these concepts in a different areas of flying? And the correlation of that would be that uh, I guess I've kind of got talked about a little bit backwards in that the minimal sink speed is a concept of being able to stay up aloft longer, which is a speed that you want to fly at when you're trying to minimize your sink rate. And and so the correlation of that concept is that when you're thermaling, you're wanting to minimize your sink rate. And so therefore, that's the reason that you want to be flying at the minimum sink speed. Um, and you know that if you don't understand the whole concept of what minimum sink speed is, well then it's difficult to correlate when you're thermaling uh, how you want to do that. So again, more often than not, and I've even talked to instructors about it, and I guess I don't. I guess I'm not getting through to them in the local area here, but more often than not, I continue to have applicants who are, I don't know if they're, I won't say they're afraid of stalling in a steep turn, uh, but perhaps they are because they almost always want to fly at a much higher speed than the minimum sink speed for that angle of bank. So it's they're not correlating the fact that the scenario that they're trying to fly steep turns around is the fact that they're trying to stay up and lift. Affective domain. So that was cognitive domain. Affective domain is motivation and enthusiasm. Bob Wander is the epitome of motivation and enthusiasm. I don't think I am necessarily, but I've always enjoyed listening to him when he's presenting topics because he's um, interesting to listen to. He's very enthusiastic when he makes presentations, and that enthusiasm leads to motivation. And so it's important that you recognize that when you're teaching, that you have some enthusiasm, that will motivate your students to learn. And then the psychomotor domain, which is just the physical motor skills, coordination, the physical movements, the muscle memory that we talked about. That's a domain in and of itself that Bob used the example earlier today about batting practice. Well, the more uh, baseball players hit balls and identify where the ball's going so that they can hit it uh, is is the motor skill that they need and the coordination, and it's actually the physical movement. And the same thing it's just when it comes to flying gliders. I mean, if you understand um, for instance, flying on tow. Um, if you understand the concept that if the glider is moving side to side behind the tow plane, it's not because you're misusing the rudder. It's because the wings are not at the same bank angle as the wings of the tow plane. If you work hard at teaching people that in order to stop that movement, side to side movement, they don't need rudder. They need to concentrate on trying to get the wings at the same bank angle, whether you're in a bank or whether you're in level flight, wings level flight, and what motor skills it takes to do that. I find that, I remember more than once, I've seen people on check rides and they were taught to use the rudder to move out to the side of the prop wash to box the wake. Well, more than once, I've seen applicants who are a little bit nervous. Obviously, a check ride situation makes you nervous. They've had full rudder, and I mean all the way to the floor rudder, and just a slight amount of bank in the opposite direction, and the glider is not moving where they want it to move. And so they're frustrated. They don't understand why that glider is not moving out to the side. They've got the full rudder as they were taught, but they weren't really taught about the fact that if the wings are banked slightly in the wrong direction, then no amount of rudder can overcome that. So and that's kind of the coordination and the motor skill that you have to develop in order to fly successfully on the tow. Characteristics of learning. Again, we're page 3-19 now of Aviation Instructor's Handbook. So learning has to be purposeful. The person has to recognize that or understand that this is something that will lead them to their goal. If you're talking, say, about weight and balance, and they're not very good at math, never have been in their whole life, and so they're struggling with the mathematics of what they're trying to learn related to weight and balance. Some sailplanes, some aircraft have charts instead of actual numbers to calculate the location of the balance point and the total weight. So you might want to learn, or if there's another methodology available, you might want to teach it in a little different methodologies. Make it purposeful for them so that they can achieve that goal. Now, if there is no other way to do it except mathematically, well then, help them with the math. It's not that difficult. I mean, adding up all the concept behind why it works is perhaps the most difficult concept that they have to either trust or just memorize. The fact that, the moments, having an engineering background, I understand how the moments can work and lead you to the goal of getting the center of gravity of the loaded glider. But you don't necessarily have to understand that. Just if you just trust in the math, just say, if you add up all these moments and you add up all these weights and you make a simple division, you can use your calculator, the total moment divided by the total weight. That'll give you a center of gravity point. In other words, the point to which the glider balances on. And that's all you're trying to do. You're just trying to find where the glider balance is. And the manufacturer has gone through his or her during the certification process. They've determined where the balance point has to be to make the glider fly safely. And so as long as the balance point is between the forwardmost point and the rearmost point, then the glider will fly safely, and you can have reliance on the fact that the glider will fly safely. So that's purposeful type of learning. Get you to the goal of the learning. Using the result of an experience, using actual experience to perform a skill. So again, we've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but the more you practice something, the more that you'll develop that skill, and it's basically because of the experience. I always can. I think it's interesting when I see somebody on a check ride. The people who have got some logged soaring time in their logbook, 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever. Well, they've been able to stay up. They've been able to thermal successfully, and I always see a marked improvement in those learners when they're taking a check ride, because they've had a chance to practice constant turns, like when they're thermaling, and make small adjustments to the coordination, the rudder, or the bank angle, or whatever, to try to achieve their goal. And so if you use that actual experience to perform a skill, I think that you'll perform that skill in a better way. Multifaceted, verbal, conceptual, perceptual, emotional, problem solving. Those are all words of multifaceted learning. Some of us are not very good at conceptual learning. We're better off to see something, perceive something, and then actually do it from those perceptions. And we can talk about it on the ground all we want in a conceptual methodology or verbally, and we just don't get it as well as we get it with those hands-on perceptual feedback that we get. And some of us are problem solvers. We like to have a problem and then go out and solve it, because when we do that, we find that we learn things more completely. I'm actually one of those kinds of learners to a large extent. Uh, I like to solve problems, and I think I learned much better through that problem solving methodology that I'm capable of doing. But that's not everybody, and that's not necessarily the only way to do it. A lot of people are learning through verbal and conceptual type learning, and do a lot better with that. So another characteristic of learning is the active process. Learners react and respond, and are either emotionally or intellectually. So that's, again, that's kind of a being there, doing that type of response that they when you, and whether it's an intellectual response or an emotional response, you figure something out intellectually, and then you can go out and react to the scenario or the situation uh, that's happening. So PT3. Well, I've talked about it on the ground. I've decided that this is the way we're going to react and respond to that situation, and I've done it intellectually. So, but some people aren't so much that way. They're more emotional about it, and so they might, when the PT3 happens, they're concerned about the fact that they may, touch the ground, or have a low altitude incident or something like that. And so it's tough for them to learn, but that's the active activity that they're responding to and reacting to, that they can hopefully uh, work out, and with practice and understanding of what's trying to happen. Do we have any other questions or comments so far? Or anybody else on the panel want to talk about this?
We've been answering a few questions online, but
Okay.
nothing has come up that we need to bring up here.
Okay. Learning styles. This is kind of an interesting. I think we all know that some of us are either left brain or right brain. Importance of recognizing which one your learner is, and one way to recognize that is this holistic or sterealistic theory. Left brain or sterealistic, and have an analytical approach. And I know that I work in that arena many times. A lot of my learning is analytical type learning, and but I also react in a holistic way, in that I try to seek overall comprehension, because I think that that's true. Um, I think that that's something that's important, is that you have an overall comprehension of what you're trying to accomplish. You can look at it from an analytical standpoint. It's kind of being street smart. Just because you have analyzed something correctly doesn't mean that you have an overall comprehension of it, and can perform that maneuver or that concept that you're trying to do. So I mean, I think to some extent we have to be both, um, but probably well, most people have a dominant side, and I'd have to say that my analytical side is probably my most dominant side. Index of learning styles. Richard Fiedler and or Felder and Linda Silverman developed a learning style model, and if you're more interested in that, I would recommend that there's a website that you can go to. It's listed in the Aviation Instructor's Handbook. So I think that was on yeah, 321 is where they have that website that you can go to and look at that. I'd recommend that you do that. Um, so visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. Vision, hearing, and touch. I mean, those are fancy words for those more common terms. Again, a lot of people are visual learners. I think to some extent I'm a visual learner. To some extent, I can hear something, but it doesn't necessarily sink in until I see it or practice it. Touch it kinesthetically. Um, but so I think, like I said, I'm more of a visual type of learner than anything else. And it's important that you try to identify that type of learning style that your uh, learner has. And in fact, you can even ask them, do you learn more from visual cues and, for me demonstrating the maneuver, if it's a maneuver, or me demonstrating the procedure that how to do a pre-flight or how to do a glider assembly. Are you a visual learner, or can you do it just by hearing about it and conceptualizing what's going to happen? And vision and touch is kind of go hand in hand, so to speak. And that if you're talking about a glider assembly or disassembly procedure, it's probably best that you actually go out and at least take one of the wings off the glider, just so that they have an idea about how it goes together. What pins are necessary to hold the wing in place, and how do they make sure that the after it's being held in place, that they can visually check that the safeties or whatever have been installed so that the pins won't move. And in some gliders, as we all know, the hookups are automatic, and so, but even automatic hookups mess up if you're not careful about how you assemble the glider. I know that my dad's ASW 27. I remember one time he arrived out on the flight line and he said, "Hey, the aileron, he's doing a pre-flight, and the ailerons wouldn't move." And we took the wing off, and sure enough, the automatic assembly that's supposed to mesh automatically wasn't meshed. It had missed the pocket, and so it was locked up. We took it apart, visually inspected it to make sure that it hadn't bent anything or broken anything. It hadn't. Amazingly, I couldn't hardly believe it. It hadn't bent a linkage or something like that, but it had not. And we reassembled it, and it worked normally. So even you want to make sure that that when you go to assemble a glider or whatever, that you do it correctly. Excuse me. So this last thing is talks about the super links theory by Ricky Linksman. He refers to it as VAT. That's visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile. So visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile. And the super links is that if you can figure out where your learner is a left brain learner or a right brain learner, that each of these visual, auditory, kinetic, and tactile, they might be a right brain learner when it comes to visual and auditory, but they might be a left brain learner when it comes to kinetic and tactile learning. And so if spend you don't have to dwell on it, but if you spend a few minutes trying to see or trying to get some insights yourself about how your learner is learning things, whether they're a tactile learner or a visual learner, auditory learner. If you talk to them, it's often said that how many times do you have to tell somebody to do something before it finally clicks or sinks in? And I think the number is 8 to 10 times. So the more you repeat yourself, the more likely they'll be to finally have it click, and they'll get what you're trying to teach them. And so that's why I always tell new instructors to try to continually um, repeat themselves so that the message sinks in and they make a connection to their learners. Acquiring skill knowledge. So the stages of the skill acquisition are cognitive, associative, and automatic response. So, cognitive is where you um, is that 4 levels of learning type of thing: rote memorization, uh, understanding, application, and correlation. That's the cognitive stage of acquiring skills. Associative is where you associate one skill with another, and you can learn quicker by associating 2 different skills together, such as during doing slow flight, you associate the fact that when you're flying in slow flight and turning, you want to perhaps use a lesser bank angle than you would use in non-slow flight uh, situation, because the aircraft is closer to a stall. The steeper you bank, the higher the stall speed increases, and if you're doing slow flight at a slow speed that could cause a stall, well then that's not what you want to do. So you associate the fact that, or the correlation level of learning, that if you try to bank too steeply when you're doing slow flight, that you run the risk of approach to stall. And the automatic response stage is uh, it's a byproduct of practice. Basically, you develop an automatic response to a maneuver of what you're trying to do, and you do it because of practice. That, again, I'll use the analogy of flying on tow. Well, those of us who have flown on tow many, many times, we don't even think about it, and it's hard to put into words exactly what we're doing, because we don't think about it. And so, however, as an instructor, you have to try to relate to what you're doing, so that, because it is such an automatic response at the stage that most instructors are at with their flying skills, that they do what's necessary to maintain the tow position without even thinking about it. And so they have to break it down as to how you're accomplishing that, and how to develop that automatic response in your learner, so that they too can eventually fly on tow, which they will. Uh, And so the more that you can, the more perception that you can have, and the grouping of those perceptions to realization, the more effective I think that you will be in teaching the initial uh, automatic response that's necessary to fly tow.
Can I weigh in on this one, Ron?
Sure, absolutely.
Hi, folks. Bob Wander here. I like baseball, and let's pretend you're training a shortstop. Cognitive stage is that the shortstop is going to have to know that he or she is going to have to field a lot of hard hit ground balls, right, between second and third base. That's the skill he's going to have. That's how the game is played. The associative stage is where he realizes if I field the ground ball, but if I don't throw it to second or to first, nothing good will happen. So now they have to associate, I fielded the ball. Now, where do I throw the ball? If there's a man on first and I field a hard grounder, I throw to second, so he's forced out. If there's nobody on base, I throw to first to try and get the batter at first base. The automatic response stage is knowing where to throw the ball after you've associated the skill of fielding the ball with throwing the ball to the right place. Over.
That's a good example. Thanks, Bob. Okay, we'll move on to knowledge of results. So it's important, and we've emphasized this more than once through the training that we've talked about, is that you have to keep your student informed of their progress. If they have knowledge about the results that they see or they don't see, well, then they have a better chance of being motivated to improve what they're either maintain what they have done or improve what they have to do in order to keep on track, so to speak. Um, if you don't give them that knowledge about how they're doing, if you just kind of walk away and you just say, "Nice job today, Bob," and you walk away and sign their logbook and that's it, well, they may or may not have, they don't have a real good feedback about how they're progressing. Whereas if you keep them informed of their results, hey, today uh, you did a good job on tow. You were able to hold the position pretty well. You were able to understand when you got out of position, how to get back into position. Once we were off tow, and coming back into the pattern, you were able to understand what altitude you need to be at in the pattern and how to fly the pattern and how to plan to fly the pattern and how to fly the speed that you needed to fly in the pattern, things like that. If you give them information that either provides positive motivation that, hey, what you did was good, or it's not necessarily a negative motivation, but this is where we could improve. We got back to the pattern, but you were 100 feet, 200 feet too low, and you recognize that when you turn on the base leg and then had to cut in toward the runway uh, early because of the altitude that you were at that point in the pattern. So you knew it. You could see it didn't look right. In fact, I noticed that you did turn in, so that was a good thing. You recognized the fact that you were too low. But in the future, well, we need to try to recognize that sooner, and the fact that we need to have more altitude at certain points in the pattern so that it looks correct. That the old TLAR methodology that Tom Knopf used, that looks about right. So, how to develop skills. Usually, the skills that people acquire initially, that's usually they get they have a fast pace of in the beginning. It's not it's it's not linear. They don't just jump right in and start flying the tow. They gradually learn how to maneuver behind the tow plane, but usually it's a fairly steady progression, and initially, and then many students and most students reach some kind of a plateau, which learning plateaus are normal and temporary. It says there the next point, but they'll reach a plateau, and then from there, it's a more gradual improvement to the level of skill that you need to, say, fly the glider solo, or the level of skill that you need uh, to take a check ride. So that's how skills develop. Fast in the beginning. It's and young learners I find are more in tune to that too, because they seem to absorb the learning better. I mean, it's just I know that I don't absorb learning as quickly as I once did. I still feel like I have a fairly good ability to learn things, but it's not what I was when I was, 18 or 20 years old. So, uh, and perhaps the plateau comes in more mature learners longer, just because they get to a point where they might get frustrated, and you have to recognize that and try to help them work through that frustration and try to figure out how to uh, get to that point of learning the skill to the level that they'll need to have it to fly solo, or whatever the next goal is. So, okay, types of practice. If you look in the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, page 326, you'll see that there's different kinds of types of practices. There's deliberate practice. Uh, you learn to perform the skill automatically. It's kind of like what Bob was talking about with the baseball shortstop. Uh, there's blocked practice, and to be quite honest, that's one reason I don't like pattern toes. To be quite honest, because it's more of a blocked practice. It's good for short-term learning, but it doesn't necessarily lead to long-term learning. And they may be able to fly around the pattern today in these wind conditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so maybe you could get them soloed in a calm evening of a day after doing several practice toes just to pattern altitude, and all they've had to worry about is flying the pattern and landing with no other distractions of other gliders in the area, or no other distractions of how to get back to the pattern at the proper altitude or anything else. So the block practice is good for short-term learning, but in respects that as they go into different wind conditions, different atmospheric conditions, different days, lift and sink conditions, uh, it it doesn't lead to as good a result as they had that particular evening uh, when they were just doing pattern toes right to a certain point and flying a pattern and landing. It can have some positive effects though, in that they have the pride, the confidence that they can fly solo, whereas they might not have had that confidence when you began that exercise that late afternoon or evening. And you have the confidence that they can do it, and they have their own confidence that they can do it under those exacting conditions. And it can lead to a sense of accomplishment and motivation toward learning other things, learning how to fly in stronger wind conditions, learning how to fly in stronger lift and sink conditions. And uh, but you have to remember that if those are the conditions, if they soloed under very strict conditions, well, then you have to think about making sure that they have other learning opportunities that they can fly under. And then random practice is the best for long-term learning. And random practice is the fact, excuse me, some day, excuse me, some days they come out on days when the conditions are ideal. Some days they come out in conditions where the conditions are less than ideal, and to practice in those different conditions will lead to a longer term learning and confidence that they can fly in different lift and sink conditions. They can fly in different wind conditions with confidence because now they have this random practice of, I remember one time I was working with an applicant, and he confessed to me at the end of the check ride, which he was unfortunately not successful with. But the reason was reasonable. It was the fact that he didn't know how to slip to the one direction. So that particular day, we had a crosswind from the left, as I recall, and he was slipping to the right. And I asked him, well, what's that all about? What's going on here? And he said, well, I've never slipped to the left. I've never been in a condition where I learned how to slip the glider to the left. And he says, but I knew I had to land in a slip because that's what my instructor told me in a crosswind. We got to land in a slip. But he didn't put two and two together, so to speak, and that fact that the slip he was trying to perform was in the opposite direction, because what he would do was he'd enter into the slip, and the glider would drift off the runway, drift to the side of the runway. He'd come out of the slip back in a crab, and he actually then ended up landing in a crab because he was, obviously the slip to the right was not working for a crosswind from the left, and he didn't really understand how that, what was going on, to be quite honest. So, but this random practice theory is that you come out on different days. Some days the wind conditions dictate that you do things differently. If you have a tailwind on base leg, you have to turn the final sooner. If you have a headwind on base leg, you can delay the turn to final. It just, different conditions that you have, you learn under those different conditions in a random fashion, and you'll have better long-term learning. Another instance of block practice would be the simulator practice. And again, you can learn how to do pattern toes, in the simulator. Just you can actually insert the person at 1,000 feet above the ground, and all they got to do is come back around and fly the pattern landing. And so, that's a kind of block practice that you can get some of the logistics of that repeated practice, but usually it's a short-term type of learning. So we've reviewed, as a summary, what is learning, the learning theory, perceptions, insights, acquiring knowledge, the Thorndike and the laws of learning, the domains of learning, characteristics of learning, learning styles, acquiring skill knowledge, and types of practice. Now, the second half of this lesson, which we'll go through next week, is more conducive, to be quite honest, to use of scenario-based training. And so I'm going to not have so much of this kind of conceptual learning, and that I'll incorporate more of a scenario-based learning. And thanks to Bob, he was able to incorporate some scenario-based training in with this learning, and that's what I'll attempt to do more of next week, because I think it's really a way to make sure that people understand these concepts and how to use the concepts that we're trying to acquire. So, do you have any comments from the panel?
This Ken, I just a comment. I found that there can be a huge difference in how people learn with regard to this visual versus audible versus tactile stuff. Um, I mean, personally, if you tell me something that goes in one ear and out the other, but if I see it and write it down, it'll stick. And I think if you can understand how your student processes the information, it can really speed things up.
Thanks, Ken. I think that's a very valid point. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, Wander here. I have a quick couple. Folks, who want to become instructors, one of the most important things in this chapter is the discussion and presentation on the law of primacy. If you can break the tasks down, each task that you introduce to the learner candidate, to be small enough that they can do it right from the very first time, you're doing them a tremendous favor and a tremendous service. The other thing that I think is most important in this chapter is that you need to give accurate critiques. If somebody is not doing well on a particular maneuver, procedure, decision-making process or whatever, you need to communicate that. But at least as important is that when they get it right, you need to praise them. You have to let them know how they're doing because they don't know. You are their guide. So those are my two bits. The most important things in this whole chapter are the two things, in my opinion, that I just mentioned. Over.
Thanks, Bob. That's, your observations are very correct. Uh, I, I, I see it all the time when they get to the check ride, uh, and they're in a stressful situation. They revert to because of the law of primacy, they revert to the way that they first learned it. And sometimes they're successful doing the check ride, doing it that way, and sometimes they're not so successful. I mean, they're not as successful. So I agree with you. The law of primacy is paramount when learning things because if people don't learn to unlearn it and relearn it the correct way was much more difficult. I keep harping on this steep turn thing, but when I first learned steep turns, I was not taught correctly. And I had a conception that these are steep turns in an airplane, so that we had to maintain altitude, and nobody ever explained it to me as to why we add power uh, in a steep turn, or why there was a need to add power in a steep turn. And to be quite honest, the reason that what I learned initially was because of the loss of the vertical lift. As you enter into the bank, there's a loss of vertical lift, and you need to add power to make up for that loss of vertical lift. Well, that didn't make too much sense to me as an instructor when I finally got to the point where I was trying to teach that concept. And in fact, got back in the books and I discovered that that wasn't true, that the fact that you don't lose vertical lift but instead the way I teach it in an airplane and even in a glider to some extent is the fact that you need to maintain the vertical lift. In a glider, you need to maintain the vertical lift component in order to maintain a constant sink rate. In an airplane, you can maintain a constant sink rate of 0. And the way that you maintain the vertical component of lift in an airplane is you have to increase the angle of attack and increase the total amount of lift so that the vertical component of lift remains the same the whole time. And in a glider, you have to increase the angle of attack as well in a steep turn because you get into to establish a higher sink rate as you roll into the turn. And then to maintain, or to not maintain is not the word I'm thinking of, but in order to um, reestablish a new sink rate, constant sink rate, you have to increase the angle of attack so that you're not sinking as much as you would be if you were just allowing the aircraft to pitch down instead of increase its angle of attack. So I remember, if you look at the joy of soaring, some of the side effects of the turn. One of the side effects of the turn from the old joy of soaring, which probably some of us learned out of, was the fact that the glider had a diving tendency when he went into a turn. And the reason for that is because as you go into a turn, you have to increase the angle of attack in order to maintain the lift component that you need in the turn. And the diving tendency came from the fact that the glider was trimmed at a different angle of attack in level flight. And as you increase the bank angle, the glider itself was trying to maintain that angle of attack, that trimmed angle of attack that you had it at, thus making it into a diving tendency, which you reacted to by back stick pressure or readjusting the trim if you're going to stay in a thermal type turn. Um, so some of those concepts, weren't very apparent to me initially, and I think that I had to kind of struggle through them as I was a new instructor to try to understand better uh, the aerodynamics of turning flight. So, and I don't really have any. Usually, I try to end these with some kind of video or something from the Soaring Safety Foundation website. I don't really have that for tonight. I'm going to just go through here the future classes. Next week will be part 2, and I'm going to try to incorporate more scenarios. It's more conducive. That part 2 is more conducive to scenario-based training, which I'm going to try to make sure that we incorporate. The following week will be Effective Communication, Chapter 4, Chapter 5, the Teaching Process, and Chapter 6, Assessment. Now, as I look through it again, effective communication and assessment are fairly short topics, and so what I think I'm going to probably do, because I kind of skipped over Chapter 1, which I think is deserving of its own evening of discussion. And Chapter 1 is risk management and aeronautical decision making processes. And so I think that it's really important that we do that. So my plan for the April 16th chapter is to combine the effective communication and the assessment together. And then that'll free up the last week, April 30th, to talk about Chapter 1 and risk management and aeronautical decision making, which I think deserves a lot of attention in today's world, especially. And I think it's important that we will end up on that. Excuse me. You can see I'm still not over my cold, but I'm getting better. And then my intention is to going forward is probably take this up again in the fall. I may try to do some in the summer. I just, we'll all get busy, and I hate to, try to do something to half of the crowd and not everybody, but probably try to take this up again in the fall and talk more about the nuts and bolts of hands-on instructing, maneuvers and concepts on the ground, weight and balance, other things that our learners have to learn in order to be successful pilots. And we as instructors have to be able to instruct in order to make yourself as a successful instructor. Little tips and techniques. The panel will, I'm sure, will enjoy that as well, because I know we all have our own little tips and techniques to pass along, and I hope I know that they'll be helpful for you. So that's what we're looking for going forward. Before we break for the evening, does anybody have any questions?
There have been no new questions showing up.
Okay.
Couple nice comments. Congratulations.
Yeah. So I'll try to get a little better for next week. I